The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot, and silence crawled through the courtroom. Every eye turned to the man in uniform who had just raised his right hand, swearing under oath to tell the truth. His name was Deputy Carlos Ramirez, 7 years on the force, the kind of officer whose badge was supposed to mean credibility. But across the aisle sat Marcus Hale, a working man in his 30s, accused of evading arrest. A charge that, if it stuck, would carve his life into a record of guilt he didn't deserve. His only crime that night was driving slowly with his hazard lights flashing, searching for a safe place to pull over. Yet here he was, fighting for his future. The prosecutor's voice painted Marcus as reckless, dangerous, and untrustworthy. The accusation was simple. He had seen the red and blue lights in his mirror and had refused to stop. To many in the room, that was enough. But the law is not built on assumptions. It is built on evidence, on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And in this trial, truth and lies were about to collide. Judge Evelyn Boyd sat elevated above them all, her gaze steady, her reputation unshakable. She had watched careers rise and collapse inside this chamber, but rarely did she see a case where the ground cracked so early. The defense attorney, Anthony Vega, leaned over his notes, his jaw tight, waiting for Ramirez to speak. Because the moment the deputy opened his mouth, contradictions began to drip like water through stone. He claimed Marcus's car didn't meet the basic requirements of the transportation code. He insisted the headlights were missing. He suggested the stop was justified from the first second. Yet the dashcam video, the silent witness no one could intimidate, told another story. It showed 3 headlights burning bright, Marcus driving at the speed limit, hazard lights blinking like a signal flare saying, "I see you. I'm not running. I'm just finding safety." The crowd shifted in their seats, some frowning, others whispering. Was this really about public safety, or about a deputy determined to turn a routine stop into a criminal charge? Judge Boyd's hand hovered over her notes, her eyes narrowing. The courtroom felt suspended in the air, like a held breath. Because everyone understood the weight of what was happening. When an officer takes the stand and the truth doesn't align with his oath, it is not just one man's freedom at risk. It is the integrity of the justice system itself. And on this morning, the scales of justice trembled, waiting to see which way they would fall. The charge itself was deceptively simple, evading arrest in a vehicle. On paper, it sounded cut and dry, the kind of offense judges processed by the dozen every week. Yet as the courtroom settled, Judge Evelyn Boyd knew this wasn't just another line on the docket. The state painted Marcus Hale as a man who had openly defied law enforcement, ignoring flashing lights, sirens, and ignoring authority. To the prosecutor, it was a matter of compliance. When the patrol car signaled him to stop, Marcus didn't. And that, they claimed, made him guilty. They spoke with confidence, arguing that when public trust in police depends on obedience to lawful orders, hesitation is treated as resistance, and resistance as flight. But the defense had a different story, one stitched together with facts rather than assumptions. Attorney Anthony Vega rose calmly, but his voice carried a weight that cut across the room. He reminded the court that evidence matters, that justice is not about labels or quick judgments, but about the truth. He told the court that Marcus never ran, never weaved through traffic, never accelerated recklessly. He drove with hazard lights on, signaling awareness, and looked for a safe, well-lit area to pull over. Every second of his driving was captured on dashcam footage, the kind of video evidence that doesn't bend under pressure or shift with human memory. And that footage, Vega promised, would reveal the heart of the matter. In the days leading to the trial, Marcus's life had been dismantled. Arrest reports circulated. His name dragged through databases, flagged as if he were a threat to public safety. Friends questioned him. Employers hesitated. The stigma of being accused of resisting police weighed heavily even before a verdict was read. He sat in court now with his head held high, but the strain showed in the tightness of his jaw, the grip of his hands folded in his lap. He knew how quickly an accusation could become a permanent scar, how a single word, guilty, could erase years of honest work. And yet, the evidence told a story far removed from the state's narrative. The prosecutor leaned on broad legal principles, citing cases where hesitation was equated with fleeing. They wanted Judge Boyd to believe that slowing down instead of stopping instantly was itself a crime. They repeated the phrase failure to yield like a mantra, hoping repetition would outweigh reason. But Vega countered with precision. He highlighted that under Texas law, the state carried the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He reminded the court that no statute required a driver to slam on the brakes in the middle of a construction zone. No rule demanded a man put his safety at risk by pulling over into darkness. He emphasized that Marcus followed exactly what the Texas Driver's Handbook suggested: slow down, turn on hazard lights, and search for a safe place to stop. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't an opinion. It was the written guideline published by the very Department of Public Safety that the state claimed to represent. Judge Boyd listened closely, pen scratching notes, her eyes moving from the attorney to the defendant, then back to the officer preparing to testify. She knew this case balanced on credibility, the credibility of an officer's sworn word against the cold, mechanical eye of the camera. And the tension in the room grew thicker with every exchange. The public gallery sensed it too. Families sat stiff, whispering among themselves. Some nodded at the defense's logic. Others eyed Marcus with suspicion. But no one could escape the unease that settled over the proceedings, the feeling that beneath the official language and formal rituals, the truth was about to collide with power. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just one man on trial. He stood in place of every driver who had ever wondered whether pulling over on the shoulder in darkness was safe, every citizen who had felt the weight of flashing lights in the mirror, and the fear that a simple choice might be judged as defiance. For him, the consequences were real: a criminal conviction, fines, probation, perhaps even jail time. For the justice system, the consequences were larger. Whether the truth in the dashcam would matter more than the narrative of an officer determined to secure a conviction. Judge Boyd's eyes lingered on the video monitor, where the still frame of the patrol car frozen behind Marcus's sedan waited to be played. She leaned back slightly, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. The state had presented its version, the defense had raised its shield, and now the trial would move forward. The room braced itself because the next testimony would decide whether Marcus Hale was a reckless fugitive or a citizen wrongfully accused under the harsh glare of flashing lights. Deputy Carlos Ramirez took the stand with the practiced confidence of someone who had testified before. His uniform was pressed, his voice steady, but beneath the surface, his words carried cracks. He told the court that the reason he stopped Marcus Hale was defective equipment, that Marcus's vehicle didn't meet the requirements of the transportation code. He insisted the car had only 3 functioning headlights instead of 4. It sounded official, technical, almost unassailable, until Anthony Vega began his cross-examination. Vega's tone was measured but sharp, every question cutting away at the story Ramirez had built. Deputy, are you familiar with Section 547.321 of the Texas Transportation Code? The deputy hesitated, then nodded. That code requires at least 2 headlamps on a vehicle, correct? Another pause. Yes. Vega leaned forward. And on the night in question, Marcus Hale's vehicle had 3 functioning headlamps, didn't it? The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Yes. A ripple moved through the courtroom. For the first time, Ramirez's testimony clashed with the written law, and the weight of that contradiction hung heavy. The state had presented a narrative of evading arrest, but the foundation of that narrative, the traffic violation that justified the stop, was beginning to crumble. Vega pressed harder. He reminded Ramirez and the court that the dashcam video showed headlights fully operational. He asked why, If the deputy truly believed the car was unsafe, he didn't activate the dashcam sooner to capture the alleged violation. Ramirez offered explanations, but each one sounded thinner, less convincing. The silence in the room after each exchange felt like judgment in itself. The defense wasn't finished. Vega then turned to the Texas Driver's Handbook, a publication of the Department of Public Safety. He asked Ramirez to read aloud the section advising drivers what to do when pulled over by law enforcement. The words were plain: slow down, turn on hazard lights, and pull over to the right in a safe, well-lit area. Every jurist, every spectator, every official in the room heard those words. And every eye turned back to the dashcam, where Marcus had done exactly that. Hazard lights flashing, speed controlled, searching for safety. The law didn't demand a blind stop on the shoulder of a dark construction zone. It required judgment and caution, exactly what Marcus demonstrated. Ramirez tried to suggest that Marcus could have stopped sooner, that there were places he might have pulled over, but Vega methodically dismantled that claim too. He walked through the video frame by frame, showing the court the barren right shoulder, dirt, grass, and darkness, hardly a safe environment for either the driver or the officer. He contrasted that with the eventual stop. A well-lit side road, free of traffic, exactly what the handbook described. The argument was precise and devastating. For the judge, the issue was no longer whether Marcus had hesitated, but whether his hesitation was reasonable. And reason was on his side. The prosecutor attempted to recover, questioning whether Marcus had ever read the handbook, whether he could have known its guidance. But Vega countered swiftly. The law doesn't require a citizen to memorize publications, only to act responsibly. Marcus had done that. The handbook wasn't a secret strategy. It was common sense codified by the state itself. As Ramirez stumbled under questioning, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. Spectators leaned forward, recognizing the pattern of a witness struggling against facts. Judge Evelyn Boyd's pen stopped moving, her eyes fixed on the deputy as though weighing every syllable. She had seen officers testify countless times, but rarely had she seen one boxed in so tightly by his own contradictions. Marcus sat silently, his hands clenched, his eyes locked on the table before him. This was the moment his fate tilted. The credibility of the officer who arrested him was unraveling piece by piece. If Ramirez's testimony couldn't stand, then neither could the state's case. What began as a simple charge of evading arrest was transforming into something larger, a question of integrity under oath. And the longer the cross-examination went on, the clearer it became. This trial was no longer just about Marcus Hale's actions. It was about whether the badge itself could be trusted when its bearer bent the truth to justify a stop. The tension grew heavier, and though no verdict had yet been spoken, the balance of the courtroom was already shifting toward revelation. The courtroom lights hummed faintly as the monitor flickered to life, the dashcam footage now the silent witness that no one could intimidate or reshape. Every juror, every spectator, and every official leaned in, the image pulling them into the night when Marcus Hale's freedom was nearly stripped away. On the grainy video, the red sedan rolled forward with steady composure, hazard lights flashing like a beacon against the darkness. Deputy Carlos Ramirez's patrol car followed closely behind, its emergency lights strobing in the distance. Anthony Vega rose, remote in hand, his tone even but sharp enough to cut through doubt. "Your Honor," he said, "watch carefully. This is the reality, not the story we've been fed." At 2 minutes in, he froze the frame. Marcus's car moved at the exact speed limit. Vega pointed. Not weaving, not swerving, not accelerating, just controlled driving, hazard lights activated. Judge Evelyn Boyd leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The state had insisted Marcus was evading, but the image said otherwise. The courtroom air tightened. Ramirez shifted in the witness chair, his jaw flexing. "He could have stopped sooner," the deputy muttered. Vega pounced, his voice low but relentless. Sooner? On that shoulder? Dirt, no streetlights, no cover but darkness. You would have him pull over there and risk his life? He advanced the footage, showing barren patches of gravel to the right of Marcus's car, dangerous terrain that no reasonable driver would choose. The Texas Driver's Handbook, Vega pressed, advises drivers to move to the right and find a well-lit area. Isn't that exactly what Marcus Hale did? Ramirez hesitated, the silence heavier than words. Finally, he murmured, Yes, but Vega didn't let him finish. No buts, Deputy. You swore under oath. Tell this court, did Marcus Hale speed away from you? Did he extinguish his lights to hide? Did he weave through traffic like a man trying to escape? Ramirez's voice faltered. No. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The words had slipped from him like a confession, undeniable and irreversible. Vega turned back to the judge. So what are we left with? A man who obeyed traffic laws, wore his seatbelt, had valid registration, turned on his hazard lights, and pulled into a safe, well-lit area to stop. That is not evading arrest. That is compliance. The deputy's face hardened, but the cracks in his testimony widened as Vega replayed the video in increments, dissecting every second. At 3 minutes and 20 seconds, Marcus slowed further. At 3 minutes and 50, he signaled right and moved into the lane. At 4 minutes 28, he stopped at a safe location with clear visibility. Vega narrated each frame, aligning the handbook's instructions with Marcus's every action. It was a devastating rhythm, each fact hammering the state's narrative flat. The prosecutor tried to object, suggesting that delayed compliance still met the legal threshold of fleeing. They cited case law, Lopez versus State, arguing that fleeing slowly is still fleeing. But Judge Boyd cut in, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. Counselor, the question here is intent. This video shows caution, not evasion. Don't confuse prudence with guilt. The prosecutor sank back, their momentum blunted. The power shifted again. Ramirez attempted to salvage his credibility, claiming Marcus had defective headlights that justified the stop. But Vega snapped the footage to the opening seconds, highlighting the bright beams cast across the pavement. 3 headlights working, Vega said firmly. The law requires 2. He had more than enough. Deputy Ramirez told this court otherwise. That is not a mistake. It is a falsehood under oath. The gallery gasped. Ramirez's lips tightened, but he could not escape the visual truth shining on the screen. Judge Boyd's gaze locked on him, unflinching, as if she could see straight through his uniform to the weakness beneath. The defense attorney delivered his strike. Deputy, this entire case rests on your claim of a violation that never existed. Without it, there was no lawful reason to stop my client. Without it, every second that followed was the product of a lie. The silence that followed was suffocating. The jury leaned forward. Even the court reporters seemed to pause. Marcus Hale, who had remained stone still for so long, finally lifted his eyes. For the first time, the tension in his shoulders eased, if only slightly. In that moment, the imbalance between a citizen and the state had begun to tilt back toward fairness. The climax of the trial was not in shouting or spectacle, but in the quiet collapse of credibility. Each contradiction from Ramirez was a nail sealing the state's case shut. Each replay of the footage pulled the truth into sharper relief. Marcus was not fleeing, he was surviving. Judge Boyd made notes deliberately, her pen scratching against paper, her expression controlled but visibly hardened. She knew that a sworn officer had entered her courtroom and offered testimony contradicted by law, by video, and by his own admissions. The badge was supposed to represent integrity, but today it carried the stain of falsehood. When Vega rested, he didn't raise his voice or gesture wildly. He simply set down the remote and said, "The evidence speaks for itself." And it did. The screen went black, the echoes of the hazard lights still flashing in the minds of everyone watching. In that darkness, the truth became impossible to ignore. Marcus Hale had been accused of a crime he did not commit, and the one man sworn to uphold justice had nearly destroyed it with a lie. Judge Boyd's eyes lifted at last, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of consequence. "We will reconvene after a recess," she said, her tone signaling what the gallery already knew, that the scales of justice had shifted and that no amount of argument could push them back the other way. When the recess ended and the courtroom filled again, the weight in the air was different. People had left whispering doubts and returned with the expectation of answers. Judge Evelyn Boyd re-entered, her black robe flowing, her face stern, and when she sat, silence spread like a shadow. This was no longer about one traffic stop. It was about truth under oath, about the credibility of a badge, and about whether justice meant anything at all when authority was questioned by evidence. The prosecutor rose first, attempting to salvage the case. Their voice was steady but strained, insisting that the dashcam still showed delayed compliance, that Marcus Hale could have pulled over earlier, that intent mattered more than the exact location of the stop. They cited precedent again, case law where hesitation was treated as evasion. They tried to remind the court that police officers must have discretion, that hesitation places officers at risk, and that public safety outweighs personal caution. It was a plea more than an argument, an effort to keep the narrative alive after it had already unraveled. Judge Boyd listened, but her eyes flicked back to her notes, her jaw tight. Then Anthony Vega stood, his suit slightly rumpled from hours of battle, but his resolve unbroken. His voice carried not just for his client, but for everyone who had ever faced the imbalance of power between citizen and officer. "Your Honor," he began, "the prosecution wants to blur the lines between caution and crime. They ask you to ignore evidence and rely on assumptions, but the law doesn't deal in assumptions. It deals in proof." He paced slowly, gesturing toward the monitor that had already sealed much of the case. "We saw Marcus Hale drive under the speed limit, hazard lights flashing, every action aligned with the Department of Public Safety's own handbook. We saw him turn into a safe, well-lit location, not a dark shoulder where lives are put at risk. And we saw that he never once tried to flee." His voice hardened. "What we also saw was Deputy Ramirez contradicting himself under oath. He swore the car's headlights were defective, yet the video proves otherwise. He insisted Marcus had other safe places to stop, yet the footage shows nothing but construction and darkness until the final location. These are not mistakes. These are deliberate distortions." The gallery stirred, a rustle of recognition sweeping the room. Vega pressed further. "If this court accepts testimony that contradicts video evidence, then truth is meaningless. If we punish a man for following the law, then justice is meaningless. And if a sworn officer can lie without consequence, then the badge itself becomes meaningless." The words struck like blows. Judge Boyd's expression never shifted, but the lines of her face grew sharper, as though the weight of what she heard was chiseling away at her patience. She turned to Ramirez, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Deputy, stand." He rose slowly, his shoulders rigid. Boyd's eyes locked on him. "You swore under oath to tell the truth. Yet this court has heard testimony that is directly contradicted by the evidence presented. Do you understand the gravity of that?" Ramirez's lips parted, but no words came. His silence was louder than denial. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the judge's gaze. Boyd continued. "Kai man under oath, lying under oath, is not just a misstep. It is a betrayal of the public trust. When a citizen looks at your badge, they are supposed to see integrity. What they saw here today was deception." The room was frozen. For a moment, even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. Boyd turned her attention back to Vega. "Mr. Vega, You're closing. Vega bowed his head slightly, then lifted his voice with the conviction of a man who knew he had already won the argument. Your Honor, my client was never fleeing. He was surviving a night where caution was twisted into accusation. He was punished for being careful and almost condemned by the false testimony of a deputy who should have protected him. If the rule of law means anything, Marcus Hale must be cleared, not because of sympathy, but because the facts demand it. He sat, the echo of his words lingering in the chamber. All eyes turned to Judge Boyd. She picked up her pen, tapped it once, then set it down. Her verdict came without hesitation. This court finds the defendant, Marcus Hale, not guilty. Gasps broke through the gallery, followed by a swell of murmurs. Marcus lowered his head, his eyes closing as though a storm had passed over him and finally receded. His family gripped each other's hands, tears brimming. Boyd wasn't finished. She fixed her gaze on Ramirez once more. Deputy, what happened here will not be ignored. This court cannot and will not condone dishonesty from those sworn to uphold the law. Consider this day a reckoning. Her words carried more force than a sentence, for they stripped away the illusion that the badge was untouchable. In that moment, the twist was complete. The man accused of evading arrest was vindicated, while the officer meant to secure his conviction left exposed for dishonesty. It was a reversal so profound that the entire courtroom felt it, a reminder that the system, though imperfect, still had the power to reject falsehood and embrace truth. Marcus breathed deeply, his hands unclenching for the first time in hours. He knew he had walked dangerously close to losing everything, but the law, real law, not manipulated testimony, had pulled him back. And for those watching, the lesson was stark. Body cam footage, dash cam evidence, and the courage to fight back can reveal the cracks in authority. Justice had not just whispered, it had roared. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the echoes of the verdict clung to the walls like smoke after a fire. Marcus Hale remained seated for a long moment, his shoulders trembling as if the weight of months had finally slipped away. His mother pressed a hand to her mouth, his younger brother gripped his arm, and for the first time since the arrest, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. Not the shallow breaths of a man waiting for judgment, but the deep, steady rhythm of someone reclaimed by freedom. Judge Evelyn Boyd had already left the bench, but her words lingered. Truth matters, even when spoken against the uniform of authority. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations, half disbelief, half relief. People had come expecting another routine conviction. What they witnessed instead was a system forced to confront its own failings. For many, the real shock was not the not guilty verdict, but the sight of a deputy caught twisting reality under oath. The badge that symbolized protection now carried a stain that could not be ignored. Marcus stood, his legs unsteady, and turned to his attorney. Anthony Vega shook his hand firmly, a gesture less of celebration than of recognition. "You fought the right way," Vega said quietly, his voice almost lost in the shuffle of people filing out. Marcus nodded, unable to find words, but his eyes told the story. Gratitude mixed with exhaustion, dignity bruised but not broken. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter, though the sky was heavy with late afternoon clouds. Reporters gathered, cameras raised, microphones thrust forward, chasing sound bites of redemption and accountability. Marcus spoke softly, refusing to lash out. "I'm just glad the truth came out," he said. "I never tried to run. I only wanted to be safe." His words carried more power than anger could have, resonating with anyone who had ever seen flashing lights in their mirror and felt their heart race with fear. The story was no longer about one man accused of evading arrest. It was about the larger truth, that ordinary citizens could be dragged into battles they never chose, that police misconduct and false testimony could threaten freedom just as surely as a guilty verdict. Yet it was also about resilience, the resilience to fight back, to trust the process, and to believe that evidence, when brought into the open, could outweigh lies. Judge Boyd's decision reverberated beyond the courthouse. Legal analysts would later discuss it as an example of the judiciary reinforcing accountability, reminding officers that the courtroom is not a stage for embellishment, but a place where integrity is measured word by word. For Marcus, it was simpler. It was the difference between living under the label of a criminal and walking free with his name intact. He returned home that evening, stepping into the small apartment he had feared losing if the trial went the other way. His family cooked a simple meal, laughter returning cautiously like a guest, unsure of its welcome. He sat at the table, listening to the hum of voices, and felt the slow rebuilding of trust in a world that had almost collapsed. The moral of his story was not hidden. It stood plain for all to see. Justice survives only when truth is defended, even against those sworn to enforce it. Lies can stand for a moment, but evidence endures. And though Marcus Hale's ordeal was harrowing, it left behind a reminder for every citizen, every officer, every judge, that accountability is not optional. It is the backbone of justice. As the night closed in, Marcus whispered to himself the words he had waited to believe. "I'm free." But freedom, he now understood, was more than the absence of chains. It was the triumph of truth over fear, of courage over silence, of law over deception. And that, above all, was the legacy of his trial.